In the church I attended as a child and throughout my youth, there was a very large stained glass window toward the front of the church on the gospel side. I have fond memories of that window, which often grabbed the straying attention of a young mind. The window depicted the Holy Family, a youthful Jesus, perhaps 10 years old, working alongside his earthly father Joseph with carpentry tools. I suppose it reminded me of myself working alongside my father on the family farm, learning how to use various tools and tricks of the trade. This window somehow made Jesus relatable to me. Jesus, like every human, learned and developed. Especially during his early years, his parents and the community in which he lived would have shaped his young mind, his worldview. Today's gospel passage provides a rare glimpse into a moment in which the adult Jesus learns and develops. We find Jesus far from his hometown, far from those familiar places in Nazareth and Galilee, far from Jerusalem, which were the usual locations of his life, his ministry. Today in the reading, we find him deep in Gentile territory, an area where Jesus' deeply Jewish worldview and religious practices were in the minority. It would seem that Jesus was trying to get away for a while. Mark records he entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Time for a break, perhaps. But Jesus could not escape being noticed. His reputation as a great healer had spread to the region of Tyre. And so, a desperate mother whose little daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit approaches him and asks Jesus to heal her daughter. Shockingly to us, Jesus rudely refuses. He understood his ministry to be first and foremost to the children of Israel. And there was so much work still to be done. It was hard work, and he was already drained, looking for a break. Jesus' words would have clearly reflected what he had learned at the family table and most certainly in the wider community. The Jewish people come first in God's line of blessing. Others must wait for it in their turn. This tendency to sort people, those who are first and those who are last, that's not a particularly Jewish tendency. It's a human tendency. We heard echoes of this sorting, this determining who goes first, who gets priority treatment in both the Old Testament and the Epistle. From ancient Israel to the early Christians, we hear that the poor are often put at the back of the line. Oftentimes, those at the front of the line are happily oblivious of this sorting process and the inequity of it. The ubiquity of the sorting process makes it second nature to us. But this is not God's nature. It took a Syrophoenician woman desperate to help her daughter, not so much to challenge Jesus' use of the culturally accepted sorting process, but rather to remind him of the abundance of God's blessings. God is so generous, God's bounty so great, that even those at the end of the line can receive what they need. Her insistence that God's grace is so plentiful that it can be lavished upon her daughter, who in the culture of the day was of no account. I would argue it was that woman's insistence that opened and expanded Jesus' understanding of his own ministry. Mark's inclusion of this story would have certainly contributed to the early church's decision to expand the mission to include not only Jews but Gentiles as well. This past Thursday, I attended a webinar offered by the Mental Health Commission of Canada. The session was entitled, Reducing Opioid and Substance Use-Related Stigma, Effective Approaches to Programs for Healthcare and Other Service Providers. It was a stark reminder that the human tendency of sorting continues to our day. In this webinar, a young woman named Jess, with lived experience of substance use, reminded me of the brave Syrophoenician woman as she asked all of us in attendance simply to treat people living with opioid and substance use health issues, to treat them with love and compassion. Surely there is enough divine love to go around, so that even those who use illicit substances can be treated compassionately. Would a loving God have commanded us to love our neighbor as ourselves if doing so was impossible? Would James have written to the early church to love your neighbor as yourself if it were impossible? No, God's love poured out abundantly. God's rich blessings poured out on all of creation are abundant and to be shared with all. Can this still happen? Is it too late? Well, in today's gospel, we hear of another healing. After he had released the little girl from the unclean spirit, Jesus continues in Gentile territory, and he opens the ears and loosens the tongue of a man who is deaf and mute. Jesus, the one who deeply desired to do the will of his Father, the one whose vision of his own ministry was opened up by the pleas of a desperate Gentile mother, is prepared to intervene in other lives, in our lives. Well into his adult ministry, it is not too late for Jesus to learn and to grow, to expand the scope of his work, so too for us. Jesus is prepared to touch and to loosen our hearts and our minds. People like Jess are prepared to remind us that we are to love them as we love ourselves. Perhaps St. Barnabas is being called because of our proximity to come to a better understanding and openness to those with opioid and substance use health issues. Perhaps we too are being called to learn and to understand more the circumstances of their lives, of their need for love. Perhaps we are being called to intervene, as did the mother of that young girl, or as those who brought the man who was deaf and mute to Jesus. Perhaps it is our job, in prayer and by our example, to put the people we encounter, bring them to Jesus' attention. Bring our own needs for more compassionate hearts to Jesus' attention. That we and our world may be a more open and loving place. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.